My name is Johanna Rupp, your host tonight, and I would like to begin by thanking each and every one of you for coming out tonight and supporting your local independent bookstore and wonderful writers. It means everything to us. Without your support, we couldn't bring the incredible talent that we have every day on this stage without you, so thank you. Tonight's guest, Pulitzer Prize-winning author Jane Smiley, is a perfect example of the incredible talent that graces our stage. Jane's literary offerings are both diverse and prolific, from fiction for adults to fiction for young adults to short stories and nonfiction. Her work has been referred to as nuanced and intimate, brilliant, and vividly etched. She is also the author of the epic trilogy that follows the story of one Midwestern family through a century of social, political, and economic change. The first in the trilogy is called Some Luck, and tonight Jane will talk about the second book, Early Warning. Already being welcomed with rave reviews, Early Warning stands on its own as a testimony to ordinary people living in extraordinary times. Please join me and Book Passage in a warm welcome for Jane Smiley.
Thanks for coming. It's wonderful to be here. I really enjoyed writing these books, this trilogy, and it's been wonderful, and it's been a lot of fun to read them aloud. Can you all hear me fine?
Yes.
Good, okay. So I love to answer questions, and I love to read. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a little passage, and you'll recognize where it's set. It's from 1956. Oops. Oh, here it is. I did put a bookmark in. It's beginning of 1956. And it's not very long, and then we can have questions, and then if you stop asking questions, I'll read some more. 1956. Granny Elizabeth was bound and determined to go visit Henry in California, and Eloise too. Ever since Eloise had lived with Rosanna and Walter back in the old days, helping with Frank and Joe, Granny Elizabeth had had a special fondness for her. And so Claire found herself on New Year's Day, her 17th birthday, helping Granny down the steps of the station in Oakland or Berkeley or somewhere damp, dark, and chilly. Granny had on her furs, a set of 4 minks with heads and tails biting each other around her neck. The thing was 10 years out of style, but she was enormously proud of it. "It's the dog she never got to have," said Joe. Claire, carrying both the suitcases, had to hurry to keep up with her grandmother as she clicked down the platform toward the waiting room. "California!" she exclaimed. "You know, Claire, in a day or two I will stand on these 80-year-old feet and stare out over the Pacific Ocean, and that is a thing no chick or cheek has ever seen before. Stuck in the mud as always, just like hornbeams on the riverbank, looking at the lucky creatures drifting by. There he is." The chicks and the cheeks were Granny's ancestors back in England. Secretly, Claire always thought maybe the names were a joke, that they were really Smiths and Johnsons. Henry was laughing as he took the bags from Claire. Then Eloise was hugging her and Rosa kissing her, and Henry was saying, "How was your trip, Granny?" "Not long enough by half," she said, "but I hear this is as far as you can go." The next morning, Henry showed up at Eloise's. As soon as they finished their coffee, they piled into Eloise's car, and Henry exclaimed, "Westward ho!" 2 hours later, they were standing in the brilliant sunshine at a place called Drake's Bay. The weather was not hot, but compared with Oakland, almost heavenly. Claire kept her eye on Rosa, who slipped off her shoes and socks and set them beside an oddly shaped rock. They would pass it going back to the car. They were the only people on the beach. Rosa was 5 months younger than Henry, almost 23, but years more mature. "The beach!" exclaimed Granny with joy. But to Claire it was a stark, strange thing. Flat, cool sand running under her feet, cold water, the brilliance of the clouds and the sea and the sun, almost too much to look at. Granny Elizabeth stood up straight, her arms thrown in the air. Henry touched something in the sand with his toe and bent down. It was a shell, concave, pearly on the inside and rough gray on the outside. Claire said, "What's that?" "Only an oyster shell. But you know how they know that Francis Drake stopped here? Shards of broken porcelain from vessels he would have been carrying on the ship. By the time he got here, he had one ship, the Golden Hind. He started out with 5. These cliffs here," he swept his arm around, and Claire noticed the tall, pale cliffs looming over the grayish yellow sand. They reminded him of Dover, England, where there are also cliffs, so he called this Nova Albion, which basically means New England, and claimed all of this coast for Queen Elizabeth. "Was that before the Pilgrims?" said Claire. 41 years before. Henry scraped his toe through the sand again. Since moving into Henry's old room at home, Claire had looked through some of his books. She could not believe how boring they were. She thought it was really too bad that Henry should be so good looking. He was 23 and looked like a blonde James Dean, except he didn't. James Dean walked around like he had a plan, and Henry walked around like he was going to the library, which he was. He did everything, Rosa said. Rosa had her nose in the air, Claire thought. And when she smiled, it was only to laugh at you, or even less than that. She smiled to herself because it wasn't worth it to notice you. Right now, she was walking ahead of all of them, her hands in her pockets, sometimes shaking her head to make her hair blow, and then gazing out to sea as if she saw something that she was going to go write a poem about. Aunt Eloise might look a mess, but she was nice. How did her daughter turn out not to be, Claire wondered. Granny Elizabeth came up beside Claire and took her hand. "Claire, honey," she said, "I do think this is the most beautiful place that I have ever seen. You are a sweetheart for bringing your granny all the way out here." Claire said, "It was fun. It is fun, I mean. Albion means white, you know." "I don't know why that means England, too," said Granny Elizabeth. And then she sat down in the sand and burst into tears. Claire stopped dead and squatted down. After a moment, she put her hand on Granny's knee and pulled the hem of her blue crepe dress down a little. Granny's crying sounded to Claire like something falling, dishes out of the cupboard or ice down a frozen slope. Claire didn't like crying at all. She hadn't cried since the day her father died under the Osage orange hedge. "You know what I did when I was your age, Clary?" said Granny Elizabeth. "I played the piano. We had this old-style parlor piano, not even 88 keys, but I played it every day. I played it for your grandpa, and I thought he liked it, and then when we were married for about 6 months, he said it was irritating. He didn't ask me to, but I did stop, because I didn't want him to hear me, even through the window." Then she cried again and said, "Oh, Wilmer." Claire knew that there was more to the story. Her father's 2 brothers, men she'd never met, had died young, which was strange to think of. Claire took Granny Elizabeth's hand. "Walter was such a good little boy. I thought the worst day of my life was the day your father went away to the army in 1917, even worse than when little Lester died. I was only 19 when that happened." She fell silent. Then, of course, Howard went in the influenza after the war. She pulled out her handkerchief out of her sleeve and blotted her eyes, then said, "Oh, me. How many times did I wish that it had been me? I had that flu, too." Claire dreaded what might start now. Granny Elizabeth had outlived all her children, and if they were to talk about that and then get on to Claire's own feelings about the death of her father, she didn't know if she could stand it. She felt Granny's hand tighten around hers. Then Eloise noticed them. A look of alarm suffused Eloise's face as her lips formed the words, "Henry, Rosa." The other 2 turned around abruptly. Granny Smith saw them coming, and she leaned in toward Claire, speaking right in her ear. She said nothing about her father after all, only something that Claire would never forget. "The best that can happen to a girl, Claire, is to be a bit plain like you. You think I'm being unkind, but I'm telling you a truth. A plain girl has a longer time to herself, and when a man falls in love with her, he loves her for herself, for who she is, Eloise hurried up and knelt down. Are you all right? Did you fall? Beaches are so treacherous. Oh no, Eloise dear, I didn't fall. I'm fine. I just had a weak moment, weak in the brain. Oh my. Why is it that beautiful places give you sad thoughts? Claire held out her hand. Eloise took Granny Elizabeth's elbow and said, do you want to go back? I'm sure you must be tired. Henry stepped forward and offered Granny Elizabeth his arm. After everyone helped her up, they continued down the beach, Rosa first, Eloise right behind her, Henry, Claire, and Granny Elizabeth behind them. So ask a question, and I'll tell you no lie. Yeah, and yes.
I'm curious to know how you went about writing for 100-year span on the whole family. I mean, did you start with the core family and sort of trickle your way out, or did you start at the end and work your way back, or?
Well, she said she wants to know how I went about this. I started with the title of the whole trilogy. The title of the whole trilogy is The Last 100 Years. And that just came to me, and I don't even remember how it came to me. But I remember that almost as soon as I thought of it, I was with a friend of mine named David Francis down in LA. He's a writer and a lawyer. And he said to me, we were sitting somewhere in some hotel, and I told him this, and he said, don't tell anybody that title because they'll steal it. I thought, oh, there's my first good review. And then I knew that I wanted to write about this family and their life over the 100 years. So I chose to put them in Iowa for just a theoretical reason, which was because I wanted to explore how food has changed, how the way that our culture feeds itself has changed. And the grandparents were about the same age as my grandparents, but my grandparents weren't farmers. And so then I had Frank be born. And so as each child was born, since I've had kids of my own, I know that each child comes already made, basically. And with a very decided temperament and decided way of doing things. And I always thought that was really fascinating about children and something that nobody had really talked about that I knew of. So I just gave them all a temperament, and I gave them all opinions, and I gave them all desires, and I sent them out into the world. The children are born similarly to my aunts and uncle, but not exactly the same. And they don't have any of the life of my aunts and uncles did. But I thought, because I grew up in a really gossipy family, and they talked incessantly about the 20s and 30s, I figured I had a sense of what that world was like, even though I hadn't been around at the time. So that's how I got started, and then I did a fair amount of research and just kept sending them places, and there were surprising things, there were unsurprising things. I did want it to flow. I didn't want it to be one incredibly dramatic incident after another. I wanted it to go up and down. And so I didn't give them the world's most dramatic lives, but I had them go out into the world and see a few things. Yeah.
So going back to 1,000 Acres, and then this, I probably finished the first book and starting the second, but it seems like you have a high interest in the farm family, and I'm from a farm, and so is my friend.
And where?
Well, I'm from Washington Dairy,
Okay.
Iowa.
Iowa,
Where in Iowa?
Northwest Iowa.
Oh, really?
My parents farmed at 1,000 Acres,
Oh, they did?
and when I read that book, I was shocked.
Oh, poor you.
Yeah, but then I read All True Trials and Adventures, which I adore still.
Oh, good. So
You're a
few
wonderful
do.
writer. I don't know how you have time to do anything else. Do you read?
Yeah, I read a lot. I read and knit and ride horses and cook. That's all.
So,
I knit when I'm
we
riding.
understand the farm way of thinking, because it's a different way of thinking.
Uh-huh.
And we can also do city. But do you find that your readers react differently to the book if they don't have any farm background?
Yeah, they think it's a little slow. Maybe, I don't know. So, you know, I think, I really don't know. I mean, I try to, farm life is actually quite often dramatic and terrifying. And so I know that, and people who live on farms know that. And so if a person who lives in the city thinks that this book about the farm is just gonna, you know, be about hauling and planting and picking and hibernating, then they don't know anything about farms. I've always found farm life interesting. I grew up in St. Louis and in the St. Louis suburbs, and I used to drive around incessantly looking at the landscape. And then when I was in Iowa, I became very interested in that life. So I don't know, I think everybody should pay attention to farm life. Yeah.
I have a similar question to the first one. How did you ever write about centuries of Greenland history?
The Greenlanders. Well, the Greenlanders is one of my favorite of my books. And I had taken a lot of Old Norse. I'd been to Iceland. I had a friend in Iceland who was actually a Scottish oboe player who said to me when I was in Iceland, he was a very adventurous type, and he really wanted to go on a rowboat to Greenland. And he said, if you fell out of your boat, you would freeze to death in 5 minutes. And I said, that is really good. And so when I went to write the Greenlanders, of course there wasn't any internet or anything, but there was a stack of books about maybe that tall. And I read all of those. And one of the books was about results of an archaeological expedition in Greenland by Danish archaeologists in the late 30s. And it was really eye-opening because of the permafrost, they had uncovered things like dresses that were still, the colors were gone, but the dresses were still intact. And so I went to Denmark, I went to the museum where the finds were on display back then. And you could bend down and look underneath the hems of the dresses and see the hem stitches. Wow. And it was a real revelation. So then I also went to Greenland. It was quite, and you know, nothing has covered over the ruins, and so the ruins are in quite good shape. So it was really evocative to go there. So I guess the answer is lots of Icelandic sagas, a modest amount of research, a trip there, and then it turned out that a guy that I had met when I was working as a peon on a archaeological dig at Winchester Cathedral in 1971, the summer of 1971, he had become a Greenland archaeologist. So I sent him the manuscript and I said, "You tell me if this is okay." And he said, "Yes, it is." And so that was just a piece of luck. That was some luck. Yeah.
I'm curious, for the trilogy, what is the research that you did, or what's your source? Do you go to libraries and read journals, or what are you doing to get all of your backstory, history?
Well, research has changed over the years. So with the Greenlanders, it was a lot of books. With Liddy Newton, it was a lot of books. But bit by bit, everything's moved to the internet. So I did read some books, but most of the research was done on the internet. And there's some really interesting websites. For example, there's an Iowa model farm website, there's a Nebraska model farm website. And both of them have tapes of farmers telling about their experiences on the farm. They're pictures of implements, and so it's a very informative website. Iowa State has a website that basically tells you what the temperature was and what the weather was like everywhere in Iowa since 1900.
Wow.
And So there was that, and then there are also just books, and then places that I walked around and had a look at, and so I did a lot of, most of my research on the web probably. It was very, when I was learning about the Second World War, that was mostly books, because I wanted materials that were from just after the war. But there were a lot of journalists in the war, so there were plenty of books about the war written by the journalists who had been there. And so it was actually quite fun to do the research and to find out the stuff. Some of it was surprising, like those of you who have read Some Luck, there's that section where Frank is working on making gunpowder out of corn stalks. Well, that was true. Somebody at Iowa State was doing that. So, was attempting to do that. So I just inserted Frank into that.
How long did the research process take for this trilogy?
Well, it's simultaneous with the writing. So if I thought of that title in the fall of 2009, I began researching. So probably I just kept researching more or less for the whole time that I was writing. But and then I would I did one volume, and then the next volume, and then the next volume. So, but it was fun. Yeah.
Can you talk about your balance between inspiration and discipline?
Right on the boundary, right on the border between inspiration and discipline is the Diet Coke. And I can and also that right next to my desk is the candy closet. So I can justify this because I read a study about that they did in Israel where they studied judges who had to discuss and make decisions about paroling prisoners. And as the afternoon went by or the morning went by, they got less and less good at making their decisions, and then they would eat something and they would get better. So that people, the results of the study showed that the judges, and obviously me too, we all needed a nice shot of glucose to the brain
And caffeine.
in order to get going. So, I always say the difference between an addiction and a pleasure is that when you're addicted to something, you really want to do it, but you don't feel good afterwards. When something is a pleasure, you might be lazy about it, but you feel good afterwards. And that's how I feel about writing. I'm not so lazy anymore as I once was, but because I know I'm going to enjoy it. But I hem and haw, but then I get started. It's not really a discipline anymore. So should I go on? Okay. I'll just go to the next little section. Claire knew she was a quiet girl. Supposedly, she didn't say mama until she was nearly 2. It wasn't that she couldn't, said Rosanna. It was that she didn't care to. Rosanna was her mother. But what, thought Claire, was the use of talking when no one was listening? You could see it right here in Eloise's apartment. Some people talked all the time. Eloise and Granny Smith. Henry yacked, but in spurts. Sir Francis Drake was the eldest of 12 children. He fought in the Spanish Armada and on and on. Rosa said little, but whenever Rosa said something, we should put some mushrooms in it. The others fell silent, smiled, and nodded. Henry was in love with her and watched her every move. Eloise didn't notice because she did the same thing. Rosa was a perfect example of an only child, thought Claire. She behaved herself, but it was because she was always on the stage and the lights were always up. In the 5 days they spent in Berkeley, Rosa didn't introduce them to a single girl. Plenty of boys came over. They were kind of stinky and not good looking, and they wore messy clothes. Everyone smoked and sat around, talking and talking. They watched out to see if you were listening, but they didn't say anything right to you. They just went on and on about being in nothingness while thinking they were talking about something. In the end, pigs were more interesting. If Claire had been asked her opinion, she would have described how pigs look for their favorite foods in the slop, how they push the orange rinds to one side and eat the potato skins first, then come back to the orange rinds and nibble them. And she'd even seen a pig eat a lemon rind and wrinkle its nose. Also, pigs had friends and they grouped together. Quite often they liked the pigs who looked more or less like they themselves did. There were a couple of pigs in every litter whom the other pigs stayed away from. Claire had plenty to say, but not anything that anyone wanted to hear. Eloise took them to see the Golden Gate Bridge, which they drove over one way and then they turned around and drove back over it the other way. They went to Chinatown in San Francisco. Granny Elizabeth wanted to buy a doll and she had the money, but Eloise insisted on bargaining for it. And then when the price got down to $2, Granny Elizabeth walked right up to the woman and paid her $4 anyway. The night before they went home, they had dinner in a restaurant where, in her show-offy way, Rosa ate only vegetables. They had ice cream for dessert. Henry told a story about his advisor, who had divorced his wife because she kept mispronouncing the word album. She could not stop herself from saying album. Henry said he corrected her, but she was really stubborn. Why don't you go digging in Mexico or somewhere, said Rosa. New Mexico. There's plenty of interesting archaeological stuff there. There is. Henry's voice was sharp. But I didn't start with that culture. I started with Indo-European, and it's too late to change now. His lips snapped shut, and Aunt Eloise looked from him to Rosa. Rosa shrugged. It was a careful shrug. She knew Henry was looking at her, and she wanted him to understand that whatever he did, she, Rosa, didn't care. How many languages do you speak, Henry? Said Granny Elizabeth, oblivious. English, German, I can read French and Italian. If you can read Italian, we can work out Spanish. I can read Latin, Middle English, Old English. There aren't many texts, but I can make it through the Gothic version of the Bible. I'm taking Greek this semester. Henry's voice rose. Rosa turned her head slowly toward him and then away from him across the room. Aunt Eloise took another sip of her wine. Claire saw then that she and Rosa did have something in common, and that it was keeping secrets. Claire's secrets might be about the family life of pigs, but Rosa's were more interesting and maybe sadder than that. Granny Elizabeth wiped her mouth and said, "Well, I'm sorry to go home. And the penny jar is empty, upside down, drained dry, but this trip was worth it." "What's next?" said Henry. "You should go to England, Gran." He dragged his gaze away from Rosa. "I think Hawaii," said Granny Elizabeth. So that's a little bit of more of that. So, another question. Yeah?
So the entire trilogy's done, and you're just waiting a period of time before you publish the third?
Well, the third is going to be published in October. And I still have to read the proofs, so that it's at the proofreader now. I have to read the proofs. I'll probably fiddle a little bit with, the last few chapters. The last few chapters are 2019, 18, 17, and 16. So I have to figure out who's going to win the election. And I've sort of figured that out, but I'm not telling you. You guys have to vote anyway. And so I still have a few more little things to do, but it's basically done. Excuse me. Yeah.
Sorry. Just a little thing, but did you give any thought, one way or the other, to putting Charlie into the family tree? I mean, obviously you decided against it.
Into which family tree?
That's the beginning of the book.
Mm-hmm. No, he can't be in the family tree.
Because it was really confusing to
Well, it's
read those
confusing
sections.
until you get to the end.
Well,
So I want it to
obviously
be
then I
confusing until
figured
you
out
get
why.
to the end. I did want to keep Charlie until volume 3, but the editor wouldn't let me.
Hmm.
You don't know what Charlie is.
You don't know what Charlie is.
Well, you'll find out. I ain't gonna tell.
No.
Yeah.
You're such an expressive reader and you gesture. Do you hear them talk and do they move when you're writing them?
No, but you know, when I did that little biography of Charles Dickens,
Yeah.
one of the things I remember about Dickens was in one book, and I can't remember which one, there was a character about whom he said he'd do the voices, and that always impressed me about Dickens. Now, when Dickens' daughter was young, I think she was about 10 maybe, so he would have been about 32 or 3 and working on something. She got sick, and so he had her in his office for a couple of days. And later on she said that he would write like mad, and then he would leap from his chair and run over to a mirror and talk to the mirror in strange voices. And then he would run back to his chair and write again. And so clearly he felt possessed by the characters, and I think he felt that from the beginning. He later on learned how to manipulate the form of the novel, but from the beginning it was characters. That's not me. But when I was a kid, and I've always loved to be on stage, and I've never had any kind of stage fright or anything like that. And I wanted to be in plays, but I was way too tall, so they always made me, in high school, they always gave me the part of the older woman. So I like doing it, I like reading. There's some accents I can do, but others that I can't. Sometimes I drive my husband crazy by talking like this all the time. And he's from Philadelphia, and he really doesn't want me to talk like this.
That's just from Louisiana. Right?
Do I see the character? No, I don't. I mostly just feel them. I know they're blonde. I know they're tall, but I don't really see them in it.
They love horses.
I see the horses though. Yeah.
Since we're talking about characters, do you feel that you're controlling them as they emerge, or are they controlling you?
I don't think control is the issue. You know, you come up with them, but as a writer, but if you're lucky, they completely get away from you and head out on their own.
So which is it with you? I mean,
Oh, they get away from me and head out on their own. And I want them to. Because I remember that from, well, maybe my first conscious experience of that was with Moo. So, Chairman X, at the very beginning of Moo, Chairman X is standing outside the old the old slaughter facility, and he's the chairman, he's the Marxist chairman of the horticulture department. And he has built a big gardens around the old slaughter facility with big espaliered fruit trees and stuff. And he's looking at this stuff, and he sees a student walk into the facility. And I hadn't planned for that student to walk into the facility. But I needed Chairman X to be looking at something other than espaliered peach trees. And so as soon as that guy walked in, I said to myself, who's in there? And then I said, oh, there's the hog at the center of the university. And so obviously I was gonna, because those were the days, so I named the hog Earl Butts. Because Earl Butts said, get big or get out. So that's a good name for a hog that you're feeding to see how big a hog can get. And then when I was in Washington last fall, a guy came up to me at a reading and said he was Earl Butts' son. But he said his dad loved being named, the fact that I named the hog Earl Butts. And I said, why? And he said, because he was such a kind hog. So I thought that was a great compliment. So you want them to get out of control. They must get out of control. or there's no energy in it. Yeah.
You said that I think your grandparents were not farm people.
No, they had a ranch. They had a failed ranch
Oh,
in Idaho, but they were as far as possible from farmers.
because you seem like someone who's always somehow been connected to the land, and I wondered, did that come from the other side of your family? Have you
No.
researched? Have you?
No, the other side of my family are crazy upjohn pharmaceutical people.
So how did this fascination with the land and with farming?
I don't know, probably through horses,
Yeah, maybe horses.
because I would insist on going horseback riding or something, which meant you went out into the countryside, and I always preferred the countryside to the city, and so that's probably where it came from, through the horses. Yeah, first you, then you.
Yeah, two-part question. Do you have a favorite character from the first book? And as you work your way through the trilogy, is it hard to kill off your favorites?
Well, probably my favorite characters are Andy and Arthur. The characters who are in your family, which the others are, you always have your reservations about your family members, you know. Well, Frank, he's really smart and good looking, but he isn't.
Nice.
You said it, I didn't. And I was very fond of Andy, and I'm very fond of Arthur. But given his, profession, I have to torture him from beginning to end. But that's fun too. But I did learn about killing characters for the Greenlanders. When I was in the last third of the Greenlanders, I was going really fast. I was writing about 8 hours a day, and I was writing a lot. And I remember I would be writing and thinking, die! Die! And one by one, they had to go. It is hard to come up with different ways to kill them. And you have to be nice to some of them, and you have to be horrible to others. So what can I say? It's not a pleasure, but God would say it must be done. So I think we had one here first, yeah.
So how and when did you decide that you were funny? As a writer? Or maybe as a person? And that this had to come out through your books?
Well, everybody in my family was funny. No, I won't say that. Everybody was a good laugher. So even the ones who weren't funny didn't have a good wit. They had a great sense of humor and would laugh at everything. About half of them had a great wit. And I think the way people get wit is partly it's partly nature and partly nurture. But in our family, no one ever suppressed you if you made a joke. They laughed at you. They didn't think it was disrespectful. They didn't think it was wrong. And everybody did a lot of teasing, and so you were expected to laugh if you were teased. And then I went off to college and discovered that I could make people laugh too. But so it was when I first started writing. It's hard to be funny as a novelist. It's easier and more straightforward to be sober. But I always loved reading funny books. And so it just sort of emerged gradually.
What dorm were you in?
I was in Jocelyn. What dorm were you in?
I was in Jewett.
Oh, you were?
Cushing.
Cushing.
Cushing? So what year?
Davidson.
What year?
Oh, I'm way older than you.
No.
I graduated in 66.
It's
We're
not way older.
68.
What?
We're 68.
68. Why didn't I know you? I was tall. I tied my pants with a string.
Oh my gosh.
Nobody noticed.
Oh, you were that person.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
So I have a Webster Groves question to ask you, because I'm also from Webster Groves.
Where'd you go to high school?
Webster Groves.
Okay.
I know you
Did you
didn't.
go with my cousin Jody? Jody Baxley?
Probably.
Yeah, he went to Webster High.
Uh-huh.
He would have graduated in 60s. Oh, but you said you graduated from Vassar in 60s.
Before you,
Okay.
yeah. So Jonathan Franzen
Yeah.
also went to Webster.
Yeah.
Did you ever encounter him? You're a few years apart. Did you
No,
ever?
no. I only saw, finally, I don't even think I've actually met him.
Uh-huh.
We just have connected through books.
Okay. I thought maybe there was a
No. there
secret
wasn't.
society.
No.
Okay.
No. Yeah.
There's just one scene that stuck in my mind, and I sometimes think maybe you get some things that are so brilliantly real because they happened. You know when Mary Elizabeth, the first one, when
Yeah.
she dies, that scene, and just the horror of it, and the accuracy of how someone would have felt, a mother to be helpless and see that little girl just die because she bumped her head. Is there a family story about
No.
something? How did you come up with that?
Kids die.
They do, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've known from writing historical fiction, you know, Lydia Newton, Private Life, plus the Greenlanders, a lot of kids had to die. They just had to, or it's not realistic.
Mhm.
And in Private Life, a lot of the kids, a lot of Margaret's siblings die. And in pretty horrifying ways. And part of that was because my grandfather, who was one of 12, couple of his siblings died young. And so I knew that, so I just would have to come up with some way. And I had heard about, not children, but I heard about people hitting themselves in a certain spot on the head, and that being a death blow, even though it didn't seem that bad at the time.
Yeah.
But somebody was just telling me today, something I wish that I'd known. He said that his grandmother had to have all her teeth pulled in her 20s. And it was because she had an impacted tooth, and you could get an infection from that would kill you. And so they pulled all her teeth. And I thought, oh, if only I had known.
Wow.
But I wondered why a lot of my relatives had all their teeth pulled.
Is that
And
why?
I don't know if that was why, but, so, yes, novelists love really weird ideas.
Horror.
Torture.
Yeah.
So how long should we go on?
Maybe a couple more questions?
Okay, a couple more questions. Oh, they're exhausted. Okay.
Well, now, some of the writers I like, you kind of know what to expect from book to book. They're kind of the same, and even though they're good. But one of the amazing things about you is you're just always trying a new genre, a new style, a new, so period of history. Can we ask anything? Can you tell us anything about what you're working on now? Or?
No.
No.
I don't know how many of you have read any of the children's horse books.
Wow, all of them, yeah.
Oh, good. So there's a character in the horse books who's a minor character named Ellen, who's very contrary, in the classic contrary tradition. And so instead of going on with Abby and doing some more, I decided that I would start with Ellen, who's about 9, and write 3 slightly shorter books from the point of view of a contrary girl.
Those are young adults again?
Those are young. They're slightly younger. So that what I would like is for the people who like the Abby books to then read the Ellen books. And but you could go from Abby to Ellen or Ellen to Abby, your choice. But there's plenty of horses in all of them.
And they're so instructive. I mean, you really can learn how to ride a horse and take care of a horse in those books. They're just amazing. And the illustrations, it's great.
Good. They've done a good job of all that. Okay, one more? One more?
Anybody else?
I don't have a question, but I have a compliment. When I read your books, I agree, you never know what's going to happen next. And I find myself in such suspense that I can't, Private Lives, I could not put it down.
Oh, good, oh, good, oh, good. Please call my editor.
I was nervous the whole time.
Oh, good.
Even through the end, I'm like, oh my God, what's going to happen now? I love the books. I think you're a really suspenseful writer.
I agree.
You know, one of my great loves is Anthony Trollope. And Trollope is a much more realistic writer than Dickens. And the stakes in a Trollope novel are not nearly as great as the stakes in a Dickens novel. But from time to time, he is so good at talking about the cost of bad decisions that I have to stop. I just cannot find out what happened. And one of them is Orley Farm. And so I know exactly what you mean. I feel that way about Trollope.
Okay.
Thank you.